Imagine yourself standing on a dusty plain
Let
in
them come.
ancient Greece.
Sparta has stood here
The year
1,000
is
times
371 BC. The sun burns white over the rolling
Observe
hills of
their
Boeotia, and in the distance, the metallic
the
rhythm of
same as
marching
always.
feet echoes like thunder. For more than 2 centuries, a single city-state has dominated the military world,
we break
a
their
name
pattern.
that kings whisper with dread and poets praise with awe.
Strike at the heart,
Sparta.
not the shield wall.
To be born Spartan was
Strike
to be
at their
forged
pride.
in war. To live Spartan was to serve war. And to die Spartan was to find honor in the only way their society understood it, through battle. For generations, they had ruled the fields of Greece, undefeated, unmatched, unbroken.
For Sparta!
But on this day, on a plain called Leuctra, their world would change forever.
Sparta!
In just a few hours,
Never.
a single battle would destroy 3 centuries of Spartan supremacy and rewrite the history of Greece. And the weapon that did it wasn't made of iron, bronze, or steel. It was made of an idea.
The age of
To understand
iron
how
ends.
such a mighty war machine
age
could
of
fall,
ideas
we must
begins.
first understand what made it so powerful. Sparta was not simply a city, it was a system. A society built from the ground up to serve a single purpose: victory. From the moment a Spartan child entered the world, his life was judged by one measure: strength. Newborns were inspected by elders, and those too weak, too small, or deemed imperfect were cast aside,
Today,
left to die on
you
the
are no
slopes of
longer
Mount
healers.
Tegetus. Those who
You are
survived
free
this first test
Messenians.
would never again belong to their families. At the age of 7, boys were taken from their mothers and handed over to the state to begin their agoge, a brutal system of education and training that would define them forever. The agoge was more than military instruction, it was psychological transformation. The boys were taught to endure pain, hunger, and deprivation.
Forward, Thebans,
They were fed
to
just
victory!
enough to survive, never enough to be comfortable. They were encouraged to steal food, not as criminals, but as apprentices of stealth, and punished only if they were caught. They slept outdoors, barefoot, even through the freezing winters of the Peloponnesus. Their instructors beat them regularly, not out of cruelty, but to inure
Observe,
them to
soldiers.
suffering.
The strength
Pain
of our
was
phalanx
not
lies
punishment.
not in mere numbers,
It was
but
preparation.
in our unity and
By
revolutionary
the time a
formations.
Spartan boy reached manhood, he had become something different from other Greeks.
This is
He no
Messene's
longer saw
heart,
himself as an
a
individual.
testament to our new
His
strength.
identity, his worth,
Our vigilance
even
must
his
never
very
waver.
existence were all tied to
Supremacy
the
is
phalanx,
earned
the
daily,
formation in which
and
Spartan
jealousy
warriors
stirs
lived,
swiftly.
fought, and died. He existed
final
not for
hour
himself,
approaches.
but for the unit,
Thebes
not
will
for glory,
stand or fall
but
with
for the
this.
line.
For
The
Thebes!
Spartan phalanx was not their invention, but they perfected it beyond anything the world had ever seen. Imagine a wall of bronze and flesh, shields overlapping, spears bristling outward like the quills of a monstrous beast. Each warrior's shield covered not only his own body, but half of the man beside him, a symbol of unity made physical. To break rank was to betray the man next to you. To retreat was to dishonor your name forever. When 2 phalanxes collided, the result was not a graceful duel, but a storm of flesh and iron. Hundreds of men pressed together, shields grinding, feet digging into the earth, spears jabbed between shields, short swords slashed in gaps, and behind the front line, ranks upon ranks of men pushed forward with all their weight, driving their comrades into the enemy formation with relentless pressure. Victory did not come from skill alone. It came from discipline, endurance, and will. This was where Sparta's true power lay. Their warriors moved as one body, one
Observe
breath,
carefully. The
one
phalanx
will.
must move as one, a living wall.
Ancient
Yes,
witnesses
General.
described the
Anticipate,
sight of a
adapt.
Spartan
Our
army
strength is in
advancing
our
as
unity and
the
cunning.
march of an earthquake. Each step, each thrust, each shout was synchronized with almost supernatural precision. Other Greek armies fought with courage. The Spartans fought with
This
conviction.
plan is bold,
They simply
but
did
it is
not
our
break.
only path to victory.
And because they did not break, they did not lose. What truly made a Spartan invincible was not his muscle or his armor, but his mind. From childhood, He had been conditioned to believe that death in battle was the highest honor, and survival through
Understanding the
retreat
oblique is not
was the
merely
greatest
about
shame.
deployment, but about psychological
To
disruption.
abandon the phalanx,
It is about
to turn one's
foresight,
back,
young men.
was not just cowardice. It was treason against the very essence of being Spartan. This psychological conditioning created an aura of terror long before the Spartans even entered the battlefield. Their enemies fought, knowing they faced men who would rather die than yield. And that knowledge, that unshakable certainty, made the Spartans appear less like soldiers and more like a force of nature. For over 3 centuries, no army in Greece could stand before them. The names of their victories filled the chronicles of history, from Thermopylae to Plataea, from Mantinea to the countless nameless plains where their enemies fell in droves. Where the Spartans marched, resistance crumbled. Their dominance was absolute. But hidden beneath this perfection was a fatal flaw. The same system that had made Sparta so strong also made it fragile. The Spartan way of life was sustainable only under strict and unnatural conditions. Spartan citizens, the elite warrior class known as the homoioi, or equals, formed only a small fraction of the population. The vast majority of the people in Spartan territory were helots, enslaved laborers who farmed the land and provided food, so the warriors could dedicate their lives entirely to military training. This dependence created both luxury and danger. The Spartans never worked their own fields, never traded, never built. They fought, and others sustained them. Over the centuries, this system began to rot from within. Wars, disasters, and demographic decline reduced the number of full Spartan citizens to just a few thousand. Each generation saw fewer true Spartans and more helots to control. The great army that had once seemed limitless became increasingly reliant on allies and mercenaries, men who lacked the iron discipline of the true Spartan core. And yet, the Spartans refused to change. They still believed themselves invincible, still trusted in tactics that had not failed for centuries. It was an arrogance born of too much success. While other Greek city-states adapted, experimented, and evolved, Sparta stood still, a perfect statue of an earlier age. But perfection is the enemy of progress, and what does not change dies. It was in this world of Spartan supremacy that a new and unexpected challenger began to rise: Thebes. Unlike Sparta, Thebes was not a militarized society. Its citizens were farmers and merchants, not soldiers raised from birth. For most of Greek history, Thebes had been considered a second-rate power, too provincial to challenge Athens, too weak to defy Sparta. But history has a strange sense of timing. In the early 4th century BC, from this unassuming city, came a man who would change everything, a man whose mind would become the true secret weapon that destroyed the Spartan phalanx. His name was Epaminondas. Epaminondas was not like other generals. He was not born into a warrior caste, nor molded by endless drills. He was a philosopher, a mathematician, a thinker, educated in music, ethics, and strategy. In an age when most generals sought glory through imitation of past heroes, Epaminondas sought truth through understanding. Where others revered the Spartan system, he analyzed it, not with fear, but with curiosity. He studied their phalanx, their discipline, their tactics, and he saw what no one else saw, that their strength was also their weakness. Their unity made them powerful, but also predictable. Their perfection made them invulnerable until someone found a way to break that perfection. Epaminondas began to imagine a new kind of warfare, one that did not rely on symmetry and balance, but on focus and disruption. If the Spartan phalanx could not be outmatched in even combat, he reasoned, then he would not fight it evenly. He would strike at a single point with overwhelming force, collapsing the structure from within. It was a mathematical solution to a military problem. Simple, elegant, and revolutionary. And it would change the history of war forever. For decades, Thebes had lived under the shadow of Sparta. Its leaders had bowed, its citizens had endured. Its soldiers had been defeated again and again. But now, with Epaminondas at their head, a new spirit began to rise. He trained his men not only in movement, but in belief. He told them that the Spartans were not gods, only men. And that courage, when combined with intelligence, could overcome even centuries of fear. In taverns, temples, and training fields, the Thebans whispered a new truth, that the age of Sparta was ending. And when war finally came, as it always did in Greece, they were ready. The stage was set for one of the most extraordinary confrontations in ancient history. On the plains of Leuctra, the invincible would meet the innovative. 1,000 years of tradition would face a single, devastating idea. And in the clash between the spear and the mind, the world would learn a timeless truth, that no power, however mighty, can survive forever without the courage to change. The summer sun of 371 BC blazed over the plains of Boeotia. Dust drifted lazily across the air as two armies faced one another in silence. On one side stood the greatest military power Greece had ever known, the Spartans, led by their king, Cleombrotus I, surrounded by allies and mercenaries who followed them more out of fear than loyalty. On the other side, the Thebans, a city long dismissed as provincial and insignificant, now commanded by a man few outside Boeotia even knew by name, Epaminondas. It would seem, at first glance, an uneven contest. The Spartans were the descendants of warriors who had triumphed at Thermopylae and Plataea, who had crushed Athens and ruled Greece for over 3 centuries. The Thebans were farmers, artisans, and merchants. Yet, as the two armies formed ranks, something felt different. The Spartans did not realize it yet, but they were facing not just an enemy army, they were facing an idea. Both forces deployed on the open plain of Leuctra, a battlefield perfectly suited to the phalanx, flat, broad, and unobstructed by hills or rivers. The Spartans formed in their traditional line. The elite Spartiates took the right wing, the position of honor, as they always had. The allies formed the center and left. To the Spartan generals, it was routine. To them, war was repetition, the same tactics, the same formations, the same inevitable result. They would advance, the Thebans would break, and the name of Sparta would once again echo across Greece as unchallenged. But when the Theban line took shape, confusion rippled through the Spartan ranks. What they saw did not make sense. The Theban formation was grotesquely uneven. The left wing, commanded by Epaminondas himself, was packed with row after row of soldiers, massed so deeply that the column looked more like a living wall than a battle line. Some counted as many as 50 ranks of men stacked together. The center and right wings, by contrast, were shockingly thin, so sparse that they could barely hold formation. The Spartan officers whispered among themselves, had the Thebans made a mistake? Or was this some desperate bluff from a commander who didn't know what he was doing? Epaminondas knew exactly what he was doing. Traditional Greek armies arranged their phalanxes evenly across the line. If one side was 8 ranks deep, the other would match it, ensuring a fair and symmetrical battle. But Epaminondas rejected symmetry. He had studied the physics of the phalanx and understood something no one else did. The battle was not won by the number of men across the line, but by the pressure applied at the decisive point. A phalanx was a living machine of weight and momentum. Concentrate that weight on one spot, and no matter how disciplined the opponent, the line would eventually buckle. So he placed his strongest troops, his elite sacred band, 300 warriors bound by oath and loyalty, at the very front of his deep left column. Behind them stood wave upon wave of hoplites, ready to push forward in unison. His plan was simple but daring. He would smash the Spartan right wing, the very place where the best Spartan soldiers stood, before the rest of the battle line could even engage. The center and right of his army would advance slowly, holding back the enemy and preventing them from enveloping his flanks, while the massive left column delivered a single devastating blow. This was not just a new tactic, it was a revolution in warfare. For the first time in Greek history, a general was applying what modern strategists call the principle of concentration of force, to be overwhelmingly strong at the decisive point rather than evenly strong everywhere. The morning air trembled as both armies completed their formations. Spears glinted in the sunlight. The cries of officers echoed across the plain. The Spartans, proud and confident, moved into position with the calm of men who had done this 100 times before. The Thebans stood silently, their faces steady, waiting for Epaminondas' signal. When it came, it was not with words, but with motion. Slowly, deliberately, the Theban line began to advance. The right and center moved cautiously, keeping their distance from the Spartans opposite them. But on the Theban left, the deep column surged forward with terrifying momentum. Drums pounded, shields crashed together. The sacred band at the front lowered their spears and broke into a run. The earth shook under the synchronized march of thousands of feet. The Spartans braced themselves. The elite right wing met the oncoming Thebans head-on, spears clashing, shields grinding. For a moment, it seemed the world had stopped. Bronze struck bronze, men screamed, dust exploded around them. In the front ranks, the fighting was savage and intimate. The Spartans met their foes with characteristic discipline. They held their ground, their shields locked tight. But behind the Theban front, 50 ranks of soldiers were pushing forward together, exerting pressure like a tidal wave. Each man in the column leaned forward, pressing his shield into the back of the comrade ahead, adding his weight to the unstoppable momentum. The Spartan formation had never experienced such concentrated force. Their tactics had been designed for even combat, where every section of the line faced equal pressure. Here, on the right wing, they were being crushed beneath an avalanche of men. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Spartan line began to give ground. Step by step, they were pushed backward. To the Spartans, who had been taught from birth that retreat was dishonor, this was unthinkable. They had never been forced back, not by Persians, not by Athenians, not by anyone. And yet, the impossible was happening before their eyes. The line that had never broken was bending under the weight of the Theban column. At the heart of the chaos, King Cleombrotus himself fought in the front ranks, his crimson cloak stained with dust and blood. He shouted orders, rallying his men, urging them to hold. But the physics of war cared nothing for courage. The mass of Theban soldiers pressed forward with irresistible force. The king fell, pierced by a spear, and his death rippled through the Spartan ranks like lightning. For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence that only exists between the shattering of worlds. Then, the Spartan right wing broke. Once, a single section of the line collapsed, the entire formation unraveled. The discipline that had defined Sparta for centuries disintegrated in minutes. Men who had sworn to die where they stood now found themselves surrounded, their formation crumbling around them. Some tried to rally, others fled. Panic spread down the line as the Theban column burst through the gap and began to roll up the Spartan flank. The most disciplined army in the world was running. The rout was swift and merciless. The Thebans pursued them across the plain, cutting down those who fled. By the time the dust settled, over 1,000 Spartan soldiers lay dead, including 400 full citizens, nearly a third of Sparta's entire warrior class. For a society that measured its strength by the number of its elite soldiers, the loss was catastrophic. But the true damage could not be measured in numbers. It was psychological. The myth of Spartan invincibility, the idea that had held Greece in awe for generations, was shattered in a single day. When news of the defeat reached the rest of Greece, disbelief turned to astonishment, and astonishment to revelation. City-states that had bowed to Sparta for decades began to reconsider their loyalties. Allies defected, enemies rose in rebellion. For the first time in 300 years, the Greek world looked at Sparta not as a master, but as a mortal. In the months that followed, Epaminondas pressed his advantage. He marched into the Peloponnesus, striking at the very heart of Spartan power. His most devastating act was the liberation of Messenia, the region whose enslaved helots had supported the Spartan economy for centuries. The liberation of those people was more than a moral victory. It was an economic death sentence for Sparta. Without the labor of the helots, Spartan citizens were forced to work their own fields for the first time in history, leaving less time for military training. Their entire system, built on the backs of others, began to collapse. Within a single generation, Sparta, once the undisputed master of Greece, had become a shadow of itself. No longer feared, no longer obeyed, it retreated into obscurity. The great war machine that had ruled the ancient world was broken, not by a larger army or superior weapons, but by a single revolutionary idea. Epaminondas had done more than win a battle. He had redefined the very nature of warfare, his use of the deep column, the concentration of force, and the psychological preparation of his troops became a model studied by generals for centuries to come. Alexander the Great would later use the same principles to conquer the Persian Empire. The Romans would adapt them into their manipular formations. Even in the modern age, from Napoleon to the strategists of the Second World War, the concept remained the same. Victory belongs to those who strike hardest at the decisive point. But the legacy of Leuctra extended beyond tactics. It revealed a universal truth about power: that strength without flexibility is weakness, that arrogance is the seed of downfall, and that no dominance lasts forever. The Spartans lost not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they refused to change. Epaminondas triumphed not because he had more men, but because he had the imagination to see what others could not. As the sun set over the plain of Leuctra, the battlefield lay silent. The dust settled upon the dead, Spartan and Theban alike. The air still carried the smell of blood and bronze. But something greater had shifted that day. Not just the fate of two armies, but the course of Greek history. The invincible had fallen. The eternal had proved mortal. And the world would never be the same again. When the sun rose again over the plains of Leuctra, it shone on a different world. The ground was littered with the broken shields and spears of Sparta's finest soldiers, men who had never before known defeat. The air was still thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and dust, but what lingered most heavily was something invisible: the death of an idea. For centuries, the name Sparta had meant perfection in warfare, the unshakable certainty that their phalanx could never be broken. Yet there it was, shattered on the fields of Boeotia. The invincible had fallen, and all of Greece trembled at the realization that the gods of war were, after all, only men. For Epaminondas and Thebes, victory at Leuctra was only the beginning. He understood that Sparta, wounded but not yet destroyed, could rise again if given the chance. And so he resolved to finish what he had started. In the months following the battle, he led his army south, across the mountains and into the Peloponnesus itself, something no Greek army had dared to do in living memory. The march was bold, even reckless, but Epaminondas was not like other generals. His strength was not in the number of his soldiers, but in his vision. When his forces entered Laconia, the heartland of Sparta, panic spread among the Spartan citizens. For the first time in centuries, the enemy was not at their borders, but at their very gates. The Spartans, once feared as predators, now found themselves the hunted. Yet Epaminondas did not seek to destroy the city in fire and blood. He sought something far more devastating, to strike at the foundations of Spartan power itself. For 300 years, the Spartans had ruled through terror and enslavement. The Helots of Messenia had been their laborers, their farmers, their silent victims. Entire generations of Spartans had lived off the toil of these oppressed people. Without them, Sparta could not feed its soldiers or sustain its militarized society. Epaminondas understood this perfectly. So instead of laying siege to Sparta, he marched west into Messenia and proclaimed the Helots free. It was an act of liberation unlike anything Greece had seen before. The enslaved people, hearing the news, poured out of the fields and villages, weeping, shouting, embracing one another. Epaminondas helped them build a new city, Messene, with walls so strong and towers so high that the Spartans would never enslave them again. In that moment, the economy that had supported Spartan supremacy for centuries was gone. The proud warriors of Sparta would now have to till their own fields, and with every swing of the hoe and every seed planted, their power faded further. The defeat at Leuctra and the loss of Messenia sent shockwaves across Greece. City-states that had once bowed to Sparta's will began to assert their independence. Corinth, Argos, and many smaller cities shifted allegiance or declared neutrality. Even the allies who had fought beside Sparta at Leuctra began to doubt. The myth had been broken. The men of Sparta were no longer the sons of gods. They were mortals who could bleed, falter, and fail. But Epaminondas did not rest on his triumph. He knew that victory was a living thing. If not nurtured, it would die. In the years that followed, he continued to reshape Greek warfare. He refined his oblique formation, blending infantry and cavalry in ways no Greek general had attempted before. He introduced new patterns of movement, used deceptive maneuvers, and integrated psychological tactics that demoralized enemies before a single spear was thrown. Under his leadership, Thebes became the new center of Greek military innovation. Generals from other cities came to watch, learn, and imitate. For a brief, shining decade, Thebes stood as the greatest power in Greece. Yet, Epaminondas himself remained humble. He did not seek glory or empire. When asked what reward he wanted for his victories, he simply said, "If you find any joy in them, let my city remember that I left it free." His genius was matched only by his restraint. He understood that war without wisdom was ruin, and that power without purpose was corruption. But as with all things in Greek history, the wheel of fortune turned quickly. Sparta was broken, but Thebes could not hold Greece together. The balance of power shifted constantly. Athens grew jealous of Thebes's ascendancy. Other city-states resented its influence. Alliances formed and crumbled. The same rivalries that had once divided Greece before the Persian Wars began to resurface. Epaminondas found himself fighting not for unity, but to preserve the fragile peace his victories had created. In 362 BC, nearly a decade after Leuctra, he faced one final battle, Mantinea. Once again, he used his innovative tactics, striking swiftly at the enemy's strongest point. Once again, his strategy worked. The Thebans won the day. But in the chaos of combat, Epaminondas was struck by a spear. As he fell, his soldiers rushed to his side. When they told him the battle was won, he smiled faintly and said, "Then it is well." He pulled the spear from his chest, and with it, his life left him. With his death, Thebes lost its guiding light. The city still stood strong, but without Epaminondas, it lacked vision. His successors were brave, but uninspired. Within 2 decades, Thebes, too, would fall, this time to a new power rising in the north, Macedon. Among the Macedonian soldiers who studied the tactics of Epaminondas was a young prince named Alexander. As a boy, he learned from the greatest teacher in Greece, Aristotle. But he also studied the campaigns of the Theban general who had destroyed Sparta. Alexander understood the secret that had changed history. Victory belonged not to the strongest or the largest army, but to the one that struck hardest at the decisive point. When he led his forces across Asia years later, he applied that very principle at the battles of Issus, Granicus, and Gaugamela, using focused attacks to shatter armies far larger than his own. The ripples of Leuctra reached all the way to the edge of the known world. The Romans, too, would inherit Epaminondas' wisdom. They called it concentratio vis, the concentration of force. Their legions were flexible, their formations adaptable. When faced with enemies of every kind, Greek hoplites, Gaulish tribes, Carthaginian elephants, the Romans applied the same lesson that had once humbled Sparta. Do not fight everywhere. Fight where it matters most. And for centuries, they triumphed. But history is a circle. What happened to Sparta would, in time, happen to Rome. What happens to every great power happens again and again. Victory breeds pride. Pride breeds blindness. Blindness invites defeat. The lesson of Leuctra is eternal. No army, no empire, no nation remains invincible forever. The greatest threat to power is not the enemy at the gate, but the arrogance that refuses to adapt. Even in the modern world, generals and strategists still study the Battle of Leuctra. The weapons may have changed, bronze and iron replaced by steel and fire, phalanxes replaced by tanks and aircraft, but the principles endure. Concentrate your strength, strike at the heart, break the enemy's cohesion, and his power will crumble. And above all, never believe that past victories guarantee future ones. The story of Leuctra is more than a tale of spears and shields. It is a story about the power of the mind over tradition, of innovation over arrogance, of courage over conformity. It is about one man who dared to question what everyone else accepted as eternal truth. Epaminondas looked at a system that had ruled for centuries and saw its flaw. He understood that even perfection hides weakness, and that every unchallenged idea eventually becomes its own prison. Because of him, the course of Greek history changed forever. His victory allowed new powers to rise, leading eventually to Alexander, to Rome, to the spread of Greek thought and language across continents. One man's idea on a dusty battlefield reshaped the destiny of civilizations. As the centuries passed, the plain of Leuctra grew quiet again. The bones of the fallen turned to dust, the fields returned to wheat and grass, and the wind whispered over the earth where once an empire's pride was broken. Yet the lesson remains. No matter how great the power, how disciplined the army, how certain the ruler, there is always a way to bring it down. Not with brute strength, but with clarity, imagination, and the courage to see what others do not. The secret weapon that destroyed the Spartan Phalanx was not forged in iron. It was born in the mind of a man who refused to accept the limits of his age. Epaminondas proved that the greatest victories are won not with weapons, but with ideas. And in that truth lies the most timeless lesson of all, that innovation, when guided by vision and courage, can reshape the world. The Battle of Leuctra was fought over 2,000 years ago, yet its echo still resounds through history, reminding us that the mightiest empires fall, the proudest traditions fade, and that the future belongs always to those bold enough to think differently.